Welcome to the Psychedelic Bookshelf, the story behind the tale with Natalie Storey and Jim Tate.
All right, this is the Psychedelic Bookshelf, and today I'm joined by writer, artist, and critic Rue Marshall, the author of American Trickster, The Hidden Lives of Carlos Castaneda. Welcome to the Psychedelic Bookshelf, Rue.
Thank you, Natalie. It's great to be here.
This is your second book. You also wrote a novel called A Separate Reality, and you worked on this biography for quite a long time, I think, right?
Just 20 years. Yeah, whatever. Depends on your perspective, right?
The first thing I wanted to ask you about, I was going to skip the who is Carlos Castaneda question.
I don't know that we can skip that, really.
We can't skip it, but I was going to skip it and just try to summarize that he was the original indigenous lineage grifter. And you reminded me that, of course, he wasn't the original. And it's sort of problematic to be talking about originals. But anyway,
There's
yeah.
that.
Who is
yeah. Well, I think it is important, although probably most people listening do have some idea. There are so many kind of misconceptions and that have entered the narrative that it's kind of good to just lay it out. Carlos rose to international fame starting in 1968 when University of California published a little book called The Teachings of Don Juan, Yaqui way of knowledge that purports to tell of this young anthropologist's induction and instruction by a Yaqui shaman using mushrooms, datura, and peyote into this entire kind of other way of knowledge that supposedly has never before been shared with a, quote unquote Westerner. And the book quickly became an underground bestseller. It soon became an overground bestseller, an international bestseller. It was, praised everywhere, the New York Times, Harper's, The Nation, what have you. And it was published as anthropology. And for about 5 years, although there were always kind of rumblings and questions, they were really did not reach the public, these rumblings, until 1972 when somebody named Joyce Carol Oates wrote a letter to the editor of the New York Times saying, am I the only person who thinks that these were novels?
Didn't Gordon Wasson try to call him out?
He did, but Wasson, for better or worse, published it in that, super well-known and widely read journal, Economic Botany. So that reached, but I mean, it is interesting that did not, given Wasson's kind of tremendous stature, that it didn't really make any difference, which, gets to something, that I think we can definitely talk about, which is just the way that when people get, kind of emotionally invested in a belief, and when there's a kind of social group pressure to believe in something, they will go to incredible lengths sometimes to ignore that which is maybe staring them right in the face. And, circle back to Wasson for sure, but just to quickly jump ahead to some important points. There's never a point where Carlos is really publicly humiliated or debunked in a kind of way that, I don't know if anyone remembers the James Fry and Oprah incident. That just never happens. There is a kind of gradual diminishment in his reputation in academia, but his books continue to sell, really well and stay on the New York Times bestseller list well into the 1980s. All the while, and this goes back to 1960, Castaneda, and I'm never sure what verb to use here, is fostering or fomenting a cult, which is very, very small at first. But by the 90s, probably in part because book sales have diminished, and probably more importantly because his reputation has diminished, this group goes public and it becomes, a somewhat significant cult. They start doing teachings and workshops around the world, and thousands of people attend these, and they teach something he and these women who he calls his witches, teach something they call tensegrity, which is they claim, and here we get into the really
They all have such terrible names for these things. They just
that's so interesting because he sticks with this kind of, basically pseudo Mesoamerican shtick, if I may say, for quite a while. But by the 90s, it just kind of run out, and that was like it's a term that's they borrowed it, quote unquote, from Buckminster Fuller. It has to do with tensional integrity in architecture. It's not the best choice, and it's also because it's supposed to be something that's been passed down by 25 generations of Toltec shamans. Never mind that the Toltecs basically disappeared 500 years ago, but whatever. But anyway, it's like a exercise method, drawing on a lot of martial arts stuff that if you do it perfectly, you get to live forever. You have to do it really.
Have you ever tried to do any of the
for about 2 minutes? I don't want to but I know people who have. I know people who've gone to the seminars and so forth. Yeah, I do whatever. I'm sticking with a little yoga and Tai Chi myself. But yeah, what happens then is Castaneda develops liver cancer. His followers have been told that, illness is simply a weakness, a weakness of the will. There's some connections to what's going on in society more broadly now. And so they cannot face it or admit it. And they are told that, he's going to turn into a ball of light, as Don Juan did, and kind of evanescent to the heavens. And he'll be accompanied by this party of warriors, who he needs to have accompany him. And when he does die in April 1998, 5 women who were among his closest followers, including 2 of the witches, vanish. The skeleton of one of them, his adopted daughter and lover, Nuri Alexander, are found in Death Valley. In 2003, it's identified, and her identity is identified in 2006, and that's around when I entered the story.
Yeah, that's when the book opens, and it's like truly a really creepy scene. Yeah. Okay, I want to lead you back to Castaneda's psychedelic use and what your book says about that.
Oh dear, here's where I think everyone's going to get really mad at me. Because my book is full of some really, a lot of shocking things. But the thing that appears to be most shocking is, let's say this very carefully, there is very little evidence or no evidence. He did psychedelics. There was, in interviewing, 100 people or more who knew Castaneda, I was told over and over again, he would never, ever do that except with Don Juan. When, as one, and I started this book with, maybe there is some basis for Don Juan. Maybe it's sort of true, kind of not true. There is no Don Juan outside of Castaneda's mind. That may have a certain reality, but he was not down there in the desert, with his teacher. That was not a thing that happened.
And he did try to distance himself from Leary and the whole.
But let me fully answer that question, then we'll go.
Yeah.
There's one instance.
And Gordon Wasson pointed out that the psychedelic use in the teachings is not
it's not plausible at all.
Evidence of any use.
There is one instance of Castaneda, being reported to have used Datura, or an eyewitness account, because that's what I had to rely on. Because you can have all sorts of stories. It's like, he did that, and then you trace it back. What's the source? And the source is usually Castaneda himself. And when you realize how much he lied, it's not a good source. So I was like, who's an eyewitness? And there's one, this guy Jack Leffler, who reports having. Basically, he and I think Michael Harner is there also used Datura, but they use it wrong. Nothing happens.
Oh yeah, I remember this.
They try to use it. Castaneda did give psychedelics to other people. That's something that happened.
I remember
and
that.
He massively plagiarized. But Wasson notes, and remains kind of stunning to this day, that nobody other than Wasson and a few other people later noted that you don't actually smoke mushrooms, and why did that happen? That's what they do in the teachings of Don Juan. And Castaneda, because he was plagiarizing, and he misread a passage where they talk about smoking mushrooms over a fire. So Wasson writes him this amazing, because Wasson is kind of trying to be open-minded. He's like, this is really interesting. And, assuming, let's just assume your readers know who Wasson was. He knew a bit about mushrooms. He's like, could you please send me this mushroom? And Castaneda, as was his wont, was, oh, yes, of course, I would. It never arrives, So, yeah. Anyway, I think there was some other question you brought up there.
I talked about how he later on tried to distance himself from Leary and, sort of the fervor around.
Hated Leary. He hated Leary. He tried to distance himself from Leary from the very start. And that's not so much because of psychedelics as because of the kind of meaning and conclusions that Leary draws and what Leary is advocating, which is, basically, tune in, turn on, drop out, of course. And, love, peace and love. Carlos was not into peace. And in spite of one little passage in the teachings of Don Juan about, the path with the heart, he's not into love either. And he goes on at length about, what the real lesson of these substances is, that you are always alone in the universe, and that you need to accrue power and to, become a warrior. Anything about some kind of communal coming together was anathema to Castaneda. And I think that's maybe getting to what may be important for us to talk about specifically is the way that has kind of infiltrated the culture and infiltrated consciousness. And yeah, it's a problem. And it's also just because this is also really important, I think it's so divorced from any kind of actual, indigenous practices, at least as far as I know. Shamanism is a very tricky word, and I kind of try to avoid it, but just for the moment, actual shamanism is always in some kind of a social context. And Castaneda's work is so much about getting entirely outside of the social context and outside of the communal.
Or pretending to, but using the same construct to.
It's a thin pretense. It's a very thin pretense because he gets criticized in the first book for there being no, kind of basically for no social context, not just in the meaning of, psychedelics, but just as a piece of ethnography. It's this because it originates. Takes a screenwriting class around 1962, 1963, and original drafts are just dialogue, and he doesn't place it anywhere. And he got some feedback from that. And so in the second book, he starts introducing more and more characters, but they're just like, they're very kind of notional characters. They're not, he's not really placing it in a social context.
Yeah, this is leading to our next question. Sure. An old man told me once that the meaning of shamanism is just like whiteness, basically. Shamanism now in American culture is an idea created by whiteness.
Well, for what it's worth, I think that's really important. I'm kind of just being hesitant because I've been getting so much flack on the internet about this. But yeah,
shamanism gets plenty of flack.
Shamanism, it's a thing that has its real origins and real specific practices in Siberia, right? And it spreads, somewhat throughout Asia. And then, in the 1950s, and I never know how to say this guy's name, maybe somebody can tell me, Mircea Eliade, writes this book about shamanism that is a huge, best-selling, very impactful book. And the definition becomes so broadened that it becomes anybody who is having, anybody who is basically perceived as, an authentic indigenous type person, whatever the boundaries of that are, who has intercourse with the spirit world, and that's, so it for me, it's like a category. First of all, it's just important that when Castaneda was growing up in the world that he came from, there weren't shamans because there wasn't the concept of shamans. And there were these things that are much more specific. There were, brujos and curanderas and so forth and so on. Or in, the beginning of the teachings of Don Juan is basically identified as a diablero, which is something people pretty much managed to not see. But shamanism is a Western construct that's been imposed all over the world.
Well, it's
Sorry.
Fascinating.
Sorry, haters.
It's fascinating to consider him in this light. And so then I want to take us back to how the teaching started as a racist assignment in an anthropology class.
Well, you're so harsh, Natalie. The assignment was, given in the spring of 1960 in Clem Meehan's archaeology class, Methods of Field Archaeology or something like that. Interview an Indian. That was the assignment. There's like a class of, I think it's like 50 people. Like most of them don't do it, but then we're going to get into.
Wasn't it you get 100% if you can prove somebody's authenticity or something like that?
Well, I don't think you needed to prove any kind of authenticity. You just had to do the assignment.
You had to claim. You just had to do it.
And I think that was. This gets into some complex stuff, but probably irresistible to Carlos to just be like, well, I'm mestizo, so I'm going to interview myself. He has a very tormented relationship towards his, ethnic and racial identity and stuff that I go into in great depth in the book, but it's really hard to unpack quickly, but it's pretty central. There's a lot of self-hatred at work there.
Yeah. You went to Peru to investigate his background. Can you tell us why you thought that was an important thing to do and what you learned?
Well, the whole book is about understanding, just, some things that the book is not. It's not some, giant hatchet job trying to take somebody down. It's trying to, just to go back to where I started. I did read the books. I read the early books, when I was quite young. I had they were mind blowing. I did get to a point with, Tales of Power where I was like, something's kind of not right here. I'm not buying it anymore. So I put it away. But then, I wrote a novel, and it's a queer new age crisis of faith. That's the shtick about it. And I was trying to collage in quotes from different people. And the person who just had the best quotes was Carlos Castaneda. So that those things, they had an effect on me. And then I learned, when I began to research it in 2006, it's weird because it was the same month that those bones were identified. And I found a little article on, online about that. And I quickly learned about that there had been a cult, that did not take a ton of time to find out. So it's like, who is this person who, at least on some level was brilliant, wrote these books that had tremendous impact, they're not all garbage or anything like that. There's worth in them. There's other things too. And how does he also become this person who does horrific things to people, and they are truly horrific.
And they sold 10 million copies, so it's really it's hard to deny their influence, in American culture, and it's hard.
People are not wrong to have been very moved by those books or to have found them very important to them. They were not fools, to have that response. But I was also, I guess the other thing about Peru specifically was that I learned early on, he was in his narrations, he was from everywhere else but Peru. He went through UCLA saying he was from Brazil, not speaking a word of Portuguese, taking Spanish 1, Spanish 2, Spanish 3, Spanish 4, getting really good grades in it, which you have to be like, and he's a native Spanish speaker. So it's like, it's props to that. But why? Why was it so important to say you were from Brazil or Mexico or Italy or wherever and not from Peru? And should we go into why? Should we go there?
It's up to you, I think.
Oh, I guess so. Okay.
It's a fascinating character.
There's an immediate and initial reason, which is that he basically flees Peru in 1951 because he's like a 25-year-old art student. He's
And
impregnated
he has a
a
baby
13-year-old girl.
Yeah.
And he is like, no way am I going to do that. So, he gets to California and her family is trying to track him down. So he immediately his birth name is Cesar Arana, not Carlos Castaneda. And that led to very early on my hearing a rumor that he was related to someone who probably very, very few people in the United States know about, but was once infamous in Peru, Julio Cesar Arana.
Oh,
who,
yeah. This was fascinating.
Yeah, it's so dark, but he ran a private slave state in the Amazon in the years leading up to
And they were miners. It was primarily a mining operation.
No, that's a different. There's so many. His family was involved in mining and had significant mining holdings, and there's a lot of kind of imagery about gems and caves and so forth there, and there's a whole kind of devil worship thing that I get into. But the more important thing ultimately is that there was a huge international scandal in the beginning of the 20th century when this was revealed, that because it was, and it's almost hard to imagine, but it's like 100 years ago, communications were so non-existent that Julio Cesar Arana basically murdered 30,000 indigenous people. If anybody's seen the movie Fitzcarraldo, it's that world. And that's based on a real person. And Arana kind of overtook the guy Fitzcarraldo. And so there's this thing called the Mark of the Arana, which refers both to the marks left on the back of the indigenous slaves and the mark of shame carried by the Arana family. And I spent years looking into this. And I never found exactly what the relationship is, but he's undoubtedly related. They come from the same tiny town. So Castaneda has this very tormented, and it's encoded in the books, especially in the later books. There are these, really weird stories that once you know this, you can start to unlock what he is talking about. So yeah, it's intense. It's this person who wrote, as far as I can figure, the best-selling books ever on indigenous spirituality is related to someone who is a mass murderer of indigenous people. There you go. It's a lot. I'm like, I'm fully woken up here, but we're doing our best.
Well, I want to talk about some more of the dark aspects of this whole saga before we move on. His relationships to the people around him really troubled me. And in particular, I'm going to get us in trouble again, but here we have another gaggle of white women changing their names and not letting anyone except him cut their hair and worshiping him like, I don't know. But anyway, could you touch on what you learned about his relationships to the people around him, and how is he able to create this structure around him and maintain it and keep it going for so long?
He does it in the way that all of these guys, and it's like whatever, 95% guys. There are some women who do it too. And it's disturbing and fascinating how similar and parallel these processes and methods are. And that's something that I think really does need, I don't know if further investigation is going to help, but we don't really fully understand.
Further illumination.
Why has it become so common and so common group to group? But it's basically, here's my little synopsis of it. Somebody comes to town and they're new in town and they see a poster for, a vegetarian, free vegetarian meal and discussion of philosophy or discussion of, Save the Dolphins or MAGA or whatever. The ideology doesn't really matter. And you go and they're like, oh, Natalie, your energy is so amazing. We are so glad you are here. And you're like, oh, come on. But
Been there.
they call you and they're like, oh, just you should come back because the leader really thought you would just really. And maybe there's some people who will not follow that, but a lot of people depending on your circumstances will. And you combine that with Castaneda being in person an absolutely charismatic figure. And so it's love bombing, in other words, and you get love bombed and love bombed and love bombed. And then you're told, well, you could really go somewhere with this group. You could be really special, but you really need to make a commitment and cut off all of those people who are holding you back, and your dog and your job and your this
Oh
and your
yeah,
that.
he wouldn't let people have pets. That
Very
was
anti-dog and cat.
really a creepy part of it, that some of these women gave away their pets to be in his group.
It's a bad sign. Somebody tells you to get rid of your pet. No, I don't care. Just turn around and leave. That's a warning sign. I would never do that. Who knows? And then they're at a point where you're very, very vulnerable. And then you're like, oh my God, Natalie, I cannot believe that you have that curtain. That is so offensive. How dare you wear those glasses? It's like the more arbitrary, the better. And you're tossed out of the group. You're banished. And then that's a big moment because many people, and not just weak people, not just vulnerable people, will really want to get back because it is addictive, and we like to think that we're these, independent, rational beings, blah, 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 blah. We're not, just there's a lot of sociological literature. There's also just, observation. People really want to belong, and people really want to be loved, and we don't get it. We live in a society where we're really friggin' deprived of that. And it'll be like, what do I need to do to get back in? Well, often it will be something where you violate some kind of previously held ethical thing, whether it be shoplifting or something much more serious. And then you do that to prove you can get back in. And then basically they've got you, and it's
he was another one that he was definitely living off of a lot of these people.
Well, he did. I mean, early on, he was financially dependent on, these women. I'm just giving him a very negative picture, but he was a lot of fun, at least at first, and that's something I certainly wouldn't have known. The Castaneda or the Carlos, he's just called Carlos in the books, bears very little resemblance to the actual guy, Carlos Castaneda, who was hilarious. He presents himself in the books as this rational, objective, not at all, well before he, even supposedly met Don Juan, and a lot of people would be like, well, what do you remember about that encounter? It's just, all I remember is we were laughing so hard that I don't remember anything, and he used, and this is maybe not always a cult leader thing, but some of them, I don't know, he used that. He really knew how to use that. And then you also work in to that humor, like things that people will say things where people are not sure whether he's joking or not, and we have a president who, on occasion does that's like, oh no, I was just kidding, when I told them to do so forth. Can't you take a joke? And it's a way of insinuating things and getting people to do things. Did I answer that somewhat? A lot? Not enough?
They're just like, the book has kind of a extensive laundry list of creepy things involving his relationships with the people who are closest to him, and
he sucked everything out of them. He's sucked it up.
Coercive control and just weird things with like their diets and their haircuts and where they slept, and just weird things.
He cut their hair. He was a big, I think he did believe, that hair had power and that cutting some people's hair was a way of having power over them. What he did with the hair, well, I go into that in the book. But, it's an interesting thing, though. How much did he believe stuff and how much did he not? And I tend to think, even things where he just made it up, he would also believe it, too. But it was not like this was some kind of con job by somebody who's just, making it up and doesn't believe in it. It was something much more complicated than that.
As most stories we all tell ourselves
Yeah.
or about ourselves are.
Boy.
I wanted to ask you if you wanted, I think the reception of this book could be its own anthropological study. And I wanted to ask you if
I think
you want
trauma studies. I think that's a field. Trauma studies.
Do you want to talk at all about that?
Yeah, I sure do. The book was bought in 2019 by University of California, which was Castaneda's original publisher and which continues to publish his first book. It went out for academic review as books do. And, there were suggestions made. It's a big book. It was even bigger. I was told I needed to cut it. I did. I spent 2 years. I can't really tell you that. Scary big. It was a behemoth, now it's just a monster. I don't know. It's a brick, but it was really, really big. I don't think about the market. And then I spent 2 years editing it, sent it back in, and then my editor quit. Not because of me, but the editor just was leaving the press. That's a really bad thing for a writer. And I got kicked up, to the big boss. The old editor was like, it's fine. It's, smooth sailing. It was not smooth sailing. There were objections from an anthropologist about saying, I didn't, understand the field, which, I showed it to a friendly anthropologist. He's like, all they're saying is, how dare you question our authority, and saying I had misused highly technical terms like magic. It was a magical night. One instance where there's something technical about it in the whole book. So then it gets sent out again. It gets sent to a sociologist of religion. This led me into something I was unaware of earlier called the cult wars, which is a thing in academia between people basically in sociology of religion, which is dominated by people who say there are no such things as cults. Cults are just, cult is just a religion that you don't like. And then everybody across the street to the psych department, we're there. Yeah, we deal with people who have been in cults, and it's a thing, and it does not have to do with the beliefs primarily. It has to do with the structure, and it has to do with what they do, which is basically what Castaneda did, which is completely suck up the energy and emotional resources and sometimes financial resources to aggrandize, this charismatic narcissistic leader. And it's happening all over the place. But that led to 6 months of back and forth about, whether or not I could use the word cult, and it having to get sent out again. And eventually I won on that issue. I won on the anthropology, but then they're like, well, you need to cut another 50,000 words. You need to put back in this material about social context that you took out 3 years ago. I'm like, I don't know that you guys really actually want to publish this book, and I'm glad I withdrew it. And now, at the time that was very, very hard to do, because I'd spent 3 years and I really, wanted that imprimatur, but the book would be nothing like it is now. It would have been so eviscerated, so yeah. And
cataloging to me, like I said before, when we talked before, seems important, to catalog the language and the structure.
Mm-hmm. And there's the other thing is they're still publishing his first book, and they're publishing it as cultural anthropology. And I, at some point in there, challenged them on this, and that maybe didn't help my situation. Yeah, people don't like to admit they're wrong, Natalie, and that's just huge. And I'm think about that. I try to think about that for myself, because I know I don't, But that's why all this happened, in a way, is that, he seduced these very important figures at UCLA. And once they were in, nobody wanted to be the first person to say we were had. And nobody wanted to accuse, the very egotistical and powerful men, as it happened, who had sponsored him, one of whom, Walter Goldschmidt was the head of the American Anthropological Association. So power matters. Power matters in what gets constituted as knowledge. That's not an original idea for me, but it's true.
Okay, my last question.
Oh, we're there. The last one already? Damn.
This has been very fun. Who are the top 3 people, living or dead, that you'd want to trip with?
Well, you did give me a hint that this question might come up, and so I have been really thinking about this. So, the first one, I'll probably break the rules, the 3 rule here, but because I'm still like, I'm not sure. I think Thich Nhat Hanh is going to be number 1. It's either Thich Nhat Hanh or the Dalai Lama. I want one of those 2, along with this, because I want to know what's going on.
Yeah,
Sorry?
did you either of them use psychedelics? I mean, I'm sure that they dabble in altered states in other ways.
I haven't the slightest, but I didn't know that was a previous
experience. It's not a requirement.
It was required. I was
interested. I'm like, I wonder what I.
Well, I'm a very, very lay Buddhist, so it just seems like, probably I should go for the Dalai Lama because, if we're getting into this kind of Tibetan.
Well, they say that people that can, that meditate for long periods of time, that some of the same stuff happens in their brain as when people are on certain psychedelics.
Well, I've had a little, to a very mild degree, but sure, through meditation.
They would be amazing people to trip with if they wanted to.
No, I want somebody really wise. And then I thought about it, and then I was like, okay, I'm going to ask my mother, if she's been dead.
Oh, yeah.
She's been dead for 10 years, but she never, she smoked some pot once, but she didn't have any experience with this. And it's something I would love her to share.
Wow, I love Wiz Khalifa, and he tripped with his mom and had a profound experience of being in the room or something. It was a very touching story.
It's wish fulfillment. And then, okay, now I'm getting embarrassed, but I did, I had a dog that recently passed away. My Shih Tzu Pookie, and I would like to, because basically I just want to do everything with her. So she can join us. Yeah, it's going to be it's going to be great.
That's a thing that I always thought was missing from the psychedelic underground groups I was in. I was like, one time I tripped with this dog, my friend's dog.
Yeah.
And I just realized some dogs are exceptional trip sitters. Like they're way better than the human version.
Right. Well, they're perceiving all sorts of things that, we don't know. We don't know what they're perceiving. I'm super interested in that. So I hope I did okay on that, list there.
Oh yeah. Yeah. I'm going to end
I had some more, famous people, but I was like, nah, I want my mom.
No, that's a great list. I love your list. Okay. Thank you so much for joining us. And
it's been a pleasure. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining this episode of the Psychedelic Bookshelf, hosted by your librarians, Natalie Storey and Jim Tate.